Hello? Hello, Jesse?
Hey.
You're really low. I can't hear you very well.
Okay. I'll adjust the thing.
Hello? Right. Well, I don't know who else is going to show up to the meeting. I don't know if we're waiting for a couple more people, but welcome to this week's meeting. Can you hear me? Oh, you're muted, Jesse.
Huh. I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. There we go. All right. So, yeah, welcome to the meeting this week. Where, like I said, if we have any problems with Jitsi, we have a backup space, but for right now, it seems to be working pretty well. I know a lot of you, we talked a lot in Slack this week about the project, and so that's happening now. Hopefully you've gotten into the data. I've had a bunch of exchanges with people on, on how to set up the project and, go through the data set and everything. And I guess this week of Neuromatch has been a little overwhelming for some of you, and just it's pretty intense, I guess. So, so I guess if there are some new people in the space here, why don't we introduce ourselves? So who's new here? I think we have a couple people. If you'd like to introduce yourselves, that'd be great.
Background.
Yeah, you can go ahead. I think Prakash, your connection is not, I don't know if it's breaking up, but
Can you guys hear me?
yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Oh, did some people want to introduce themselves, or? Okay. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if people were not able to connect or what. Hi.
Yeah, after so long. So, okay, I see Prakash and Bhavik. Are you guys from AIs? Like, I went through Slack quickly. Nice. One of my podmates is from AIs.
Okay.
Yeah. Who else wants to introduce themselves, or?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, this is Sebin. I'm currently doing the observer right for Neuromatch Academy. I was missing for the last few meetings. Okay, I was following through the through the Slack. I'm from an electrical engineering background. I was working in the software field for 2 years. For a couple of Indians here, I'm from Kerala. Okay.
Nice. Anyone else want to go?
I can introduce myself. Just for the new people. Hi, I'm Jesse. Also, is everyone here in Slack, or is anybody joining from just the email list? Or I think everybody's in Slack, but I'm asking in part because I'm sort of the acting lab manager for orthogonal lab right now. So I'm kind of helping with some of the administrative stuff. But I'm Jesse. I recently finished my undergrad, and I'm kind of applying to graduate schools in cognition and computation related stuff. So that's what I'm doing. I'm also in Neuromatch Academy in the feedback. I'm in Neuromatch Academy in the intensive track, and I'm actually working on one of the group projects that was proposed by the lab about feedback right now and Bayesian stuff. So it's really cool, and I think we'll talk more about Neuromatch stuff later on. But nice to meet you all. And if you're not on Slack or need to reach out, do that. Please email Bradly or me. So, welcome to new people.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a go. They're no words.
Well, if you have two devices, usually it's like you have two devices connected.
I don't think it's actually me. When I mute myself, it'll go away.
Okay, there it is. It went away. I don't know. Anyways, so yeah, welcome to the meeting. I don't know. I guess one of the things we do at the meeting is we talk about, this last couple of weeks we've talked about our experiences with Neuromatch Academy this week. I don't know if that would be useful to you because I think a lot of you are in Neuromatch. So why don't we start there? What was covered this week and what did you learn? If anyone wants to go and give their reflections or...
Maybe I'll just firstly start with it was too intense. Somebody who's not from neuroscience or / engineering background, the tutorials were intense, very mathematically heavy. But so we started this week with Bayesian statistics, I guess. Bayesian, and then we went on to look at some data systems. Then optimal control day was slightly tricky for me. I didn't get like most of it. And then yesterday reinforcement learning. And actually, I'm looking forward to that session that I posted on Slack today, right? So Arash is going to take some questions specific to yesterday's tutorial. So maybe I'll get things cleared then. But yeah, this week was quite intense.
Yeah.
That's what I like to do.
Yeah, they have that
So
common
somebody like, yeah. Please.
Anyone else?
Yeah, it was like I'm also from an experimental background and I'm not mentioning this. It was pretty intense this week. Had a lot to do with it, and then it felt difficult to balance between. But then it was really intense. I learned a lot. It's a great week as such.
I can't hear you very well. Maybe your microphone is a little low.
That was an intense week. I learned a lot of new things this week as such. It was kind of superficial, I mean, whatever they said in the tutorial, and then I had to read a lot from inside as such. It was good. It was like, I learned a lot. I could relate things as such.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about just, because this is recorded, you can go back and look at everything and make sure that you got it. But usually, this is like the classic fire hose, drinking from a fire hose sort of thing, where you're just learning a bunch of stuff at once. And it's just, it can be pretty overwhelming. Sometimes, like, some people have developed note-taking systems, which I don't think we're going to talk about today, but that are sometimes useful for things like this, where, you just have to kind of like, take notes in your own way and kind of engage in the material in your own way. If it's recorded, it's a lot easier to do, but, there's strategies for sort of taking in the most information as you can. And a lot of times that's a personal learning decision, like, how do I best learn this? And sometimes I know, like, a lot of people aren't very good at, like, the fire hose method. And it's, we always do that because it's like, you want to teach people a lot of stuff, but it's like you have a short amount of time. So how do you do that? And,
I have, last week when last week our meeting was on Sunday because of a presentation, and it was just me and Anson, and I think, and Bradley, and I think Anson is occupied this morning because I haven't heard from him. But we had a very long discussion about a lot of things, and I won't reiterate that or go over that again, but I feel like what I would say now, after 2 weeks of Neuromatch Academy, there are a few things that really come to mind. After my first week, just going through the tutorials and whatnot, there was a huge sense of, oh my god, how am I going to get ahead? I've got to like pre-scout all these tutorials and do all this stuff so I can get it and get everything. And I'm totally not. I've completely changed my strategy for Neuromatch right now. And I would kind of suggest, I mean, find what works for you, but like I would kind of really suggest not trying to do that. And I think my biggest critique of Neuromatch Academy, which I love dearly, but would love it, I say the critique of, I think they did not do a good job of separating pacing and background levels very well. Like, it's kind of just by what level, like if you're undergrad or graduate school kind of thing, from what I understand. I don't know the actual algorithm, and I haven't really. But I feel like when people, what's the biggest difficulty has been when people are sort of in tutorials with people that are much more experienced, and there's not really a cohesive learning, let's really take this slow and go through it. And I think that's fine and that's natural, and I think that's very easily to be remedied in the future. But at the same time, like, that just kind of gets to the point of, oh, what are you going to do during your tutorial time? And for me, what I'm doing for tutorial time is, as much as possible, I try to scout at least, especially the intro video, and take the key concepts and just like, okay, here's the key concepts, and really keep those in mind. And if the coding works out, we figure out the coding really easily the first time, that's great. But also just sort of understanding, this might be the first time, like, I'm familiar with Python, but there's stuff that I've never really seen done before. And the way they're creating some of the helper, like, stuff that kind of facilitates things, like, that's just a different way of looking at it. So I would really encourage it, like, just focus on the big concepts and try to figure out the code. If it doesn't work, look at the answer, try to put the two of them together, and then ask questions and talk about it. Like, by far the most valuable part of the tutorial sessions for me has been just the discussions with other people, or like, what does this graph mean? Like, that's what it's really been about. And I think that's perfectly fine. And I would even say, I think the organizers would agree, that's legit. So I've totally changed from how I started with Neuromatch, and I think it's a good change. And even like hearing the organizers repeatedly will say, like, don't be frustrated, don't be frustrated, don't be frustrated. And it's like, okay, I've applied that more in week 2, and yeah. So outside of that, like, I really liked week 2. Week 2 was what I was hoping it to be. Because at the end of week 1, I'm like, okay, this feels like it's really great neuroscience stuff, and I like modeling, and it's kind of going in a particular direction. And then we get to like Bayesian statistics, like, okay, that's a lot. But then I missed 2 days in the middle because of, well, a day and a half of like personal stuff. But optimal control and getting to reinforcement learning, and the kind of discussions that are coming up there, like, that's kind of my jam. Like, that seems to be what I wasn't sure how much there would be sort of, I don't know, what I see more cognitive aspects of things in Neuromatch. So I'm really excited to see those things here this week, and I wish I had more time, but I'm going back, and yeah, I like this week better, but it's part because of the topics and part because I'm just not trying to Superman and act like if I just have more time and pre-plan and scout everything, then I'll keep up with the people who are super advanced and have these skills here in my pod. It's like, that's just like a kind of tension that I don't think works for me. And like, this one thing to have a fire hose, which you're trying to drink from, and then that other aspect is like, nah, I don't. So I've kind of evolved, and I'm really curious what they're going to say. I hope people are writing their feedbacks. I'm big on the feedback things they do. I'm really curious how they change it for next time, because I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a totally brand new experience, and I'm sure it will continue to improve. And I don't think anybody should. There's no reason to feel bad about anything. Like don't stress yourself out. Just sort of, try to learn the concepts and have good conversation, and go from there. That's my soapbox speech about it. That's all.
Thank you. Yeah, that was good. Anyone else? Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, that's good. I think everyone's, I see a lot of smiles, so, of recognition, and, so that's good. So, yeah, I think all you are pretty engaged. I mean, if you're here, for example, you're probably pretty engaged with it. So, now the project.
If you're still around and you haven't left, like, a lot of people have, like, just like, no.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of people have dropped out, like, of the pods that I've been around or whatever. So yeah. I feel like absolutely, like, you get around with pleasure making it 2 weeks and still caring as much to be here, for sure.
Yeah. So the projects I'm mentoring actually 3 projects, and then 2 are sort of through the normal channel, which is where they would contact us and assign us a group, and we're doing. They have a project that they have, written a proposal for and everything, and then Jesse came to me. He wanted to leave his pod and have a project that I had planned out before the Neuromatch, and so a lot of you have followed him to the project. So I think this is a good project that you've picked here. I'm going to go through it a little bit in a couple minutes. But the way I guess projects work is that we just you're supposed to engage with your mentor, and I'm supposed to provide you with feedback on it. And then, so, we need to have some division of labor. We need to have some plan forward. And then next week on Wednesday, there's going to be a poster session that is going to involve just kind of going over what the project is and maybe the path forward. I don't think they're expecting like a finished product. No. I've been wondering about that. But I think they backed off of that a bit. Because my other groups, I mean, one is really far along and the other one is about moderately there. But, they're like they're getting into the data and they're doing analyses and it's trial and error. And there's no way they're going to, you're going to be able to get this, great insight in like a week. It's just not going to happen. I think what they want for people is to experience the data, just getting their feet wet in the data set and doing some analysis and applying what you learned. And then a poster is supposed to be just kind of like, here's what we've learned and here's the problem and all that. I think, and then Friday you turn something in, but I don't really know what it is. I mean, I guess there's like a formal, maybe a report that they want, but I'm not really sure how long it needs to be. I guess I'll give you that. So I always wanted to make it clear that like don't be too like anxious about it, because I mean, try to be on top of it, but don't try to get too worried about it. Let me check the comments here okay. So we have that was about technical issues. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to a slideshow I've created.
Could I say one more thing about the project, actually?
Yeah.
Can I share my screen on this or not? I don't know.
Yeah, if you go down to the lower left-hand corner, there's a share your screen button, and then you have to pick the tab.
Oh. Yeah. That's cool. Alright, I think you guys can see this. This was an update yesterday. And just if you didn't see it, I put the thing on... I linked this in the Slack, but it's an update yesterday, and they really are bringing it down. Like it was going to be 10 minutes, and it's 3 to 5 minutes now, which I'm sure you guys know from doing presentation. It's really nothing. So what are you going to do in that time period? I think it's pretty much, hi, here's our project, here's our data set, here's our scientific questions, here's the method we're applying to that, here's what analysis we have so far, maybe look at the code. And here's the broader concept of what we think about this or what we learned from it, and that's it. Like you're going to have no time beyond that. Yeah. If you haven't looked at this thread, it's linked in the Slack, or we can link it again. But I would say, they've really minimized the projects, the presentation, and I don't know. I was actually going to ask Bradley, was there anything else that you've heard about what is actually going to be submitted? There's a presentation and then maybe something else, but I don't even know what that something else is. So,
let's see. Presentations should be submitted before the intro video and the anime. So I don't know. Oh, technical details will be coming soon about how you can best deliver this to us. So I'm thinking it's probably not like a huge written report, obviously. Probably just like a video or something. Again, I think they just want you to show that you can dig into the data and work with it. I do like the fact that they have all these open data sets. This is really impressive the way they've set this up.
I kind of just noted this. The goal is to talk about your experience in the project and stuff. So yeah, this is it. Like I think that's what it's going to be. And that's one of my favorite things about Neuromatch Academy is, how do I turn this off again? One of my favorite things about Neuromatch Academy is I think at its core, like there's really great focus on just learning, and not a lot of pressure actually on getting the right answer or like grading or whatever. I think that's really great. And I think they're kind of trying to make emphasize that in the projects too. So just like what are you taking away from this is what they want to see, and I'm sure it'll be fine. So yeah.
Why don't you put the link to that in the chat? That Slack or the NeuroStars page stub.
Yeah, I sent the chat one of yours also in Slack, and it's also on NeuroStars.
Yeah. Okay, so does anyone else have any comments about that, or? Okay, you can put
Let's start the discussion of the project.
Yeah. Oh, okay. You didn't have anything to say about it, or?
So I am new here, joined recently. So I took a look at the project objectives and stuff, and also at the data set and how it was built. I was not particularly clear about what representational complexity here we are discussing about. I have a vague idea of what it could be, and I would like to know more about how we are trying to get it from the data set that we have.
Okay. Well, actually, I think maybe these slides will help that I'm going to present, but we'll see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's keep that for the end.
Okay.
I think that also just as a if you look in the NMA feedback channel on Slack, I kind of asked Bradley about that too,
Yeah.
and we went over there. So there's a good discussion on the last we post in the NMA feedback channel on our Slack.
You might have to go through the channel a little bit, but that's where we've been putting a lot of the question and answer. So, can you see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so this is the slideshow here. All right, so these are some thoughts I had on this project that kind of try to make it a little bit more concrete for people. There we go. So this is this idea of the internal model. And the internal model is something that's hypothesized to exist in the brain. And one of those internal models is the cerebellum, and it connects to other areas of the brain. So you have these hypothesized neural or internal models that control, in this case, movement. So the idea is that when you move, you learn how to move, and those are represented in an internal model. And it's like, you can think of it as like, if I have to think about how to do something, how do I model that so that it's sort of the average behavior, or the mean behavior of what I want to do? So when you,
Brad,
yeah,
I don't know if this is the case for other people, but I'm just seeing your Google Drive.
oh yeah,
Even I am not able to see things.
yeah, I know why. So let me go back to the because it opens up a new tab, and so you lose the tab on this, but I'll share it.
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
Mm.
All right, you can see it now. Okay, good. So this is the brain. This is the internal model. These arrows, and then this is the internal model in the cerebellum, which is one of the internal models that are proposed for learning how to move. And so when you move your arms, to locations in the environment, or you walk or something, those models are held in the cerebellum. This is a hypothetical model that exists in the brain, and so it regulates your ability to move. So you don't stagger in one direction or another. You don't you can regulate your limb movement and so forth. And so this involves a number of brain areas, and it's just a theoretical construct. We don't really know, where if these internal models actually exist, or if they're just kind of like hypothetical things. So one thing you might ask, though, is what is the complexity needed in this type of internal model to accurately represent interaction with the world? So how complex does it need to be? Does it just need to be one small piece of the cerebellum, or does it need to be a brain network like this, or does it need to involve significant interaction with the environment, and so forth. And then how do we approximate this process? So when you don't have access to like neuroimaging data or like high resolution information about the brain, can we like kind of understand these models as a set of feedback loops or things that are going on that the organism responds to, and it just kind of, we see evidence of it in behavior maybe. And so your data set is going to be behavioral. So it's mouse behavior, and you have all these variables. And you'll see in the NMN, in the other channel, the NMN, I can't remember what the name of the channel is. It's something like feedback, yeah, appropriately. You'll see the list of variables in there. I put them in there as a way to just kind of put them out there so you don't have to go into the documentation. But from that list of variables, there are all sorts of variables you can look at. The first type of relationship, though, that you might want to look at is a zero-order representation. And so this is basically like a switch-like behavior, like pressing a button. So the zero-order representation is where you have the stimulus and you have the response. And in the data set, I think it's just kind of like a basic response time. I can't remember exactly what variable you would use for that. But it's basically where the mouse is just pressing a button or flipping a switch. And that's zero-order representation. For now, all the information we have about that is that the mouse is just pushing a button and then there's a response. And for all we know, the brain is just representing that with a button press and nothing else. But that's probably not that's all that's going on, but that's one hypothesis that we can build. So there's no feedback there. It's just that they're pressing a button randomly. And you can implement this in either a Bayesian model or in reinforcement learning. And that's kind of on the project description, I have a couple of different methods, and those are two of the methods that I've proposed for people to use. So the Bayesian model would have no prior, would have an empirical observation and no posterior. So it really wouldn't be a Bayesian model at all. It would just be a stripped down estimate of the data. And then reinforcement learning would be like a random policy. There wouldn't be any structure to the learning at all. But that's probably not how we learn. So this is like going to be a control condition, where you have no representation. It's just like there's a behavior being generated. You might observe like something and it's generated. And that's, you could even randomize the data, and that would be a good zero-order representation. But then there's also first-order representation. And that's feedback from previous trials. So this is now you have other variables in the data set that involve like different learning parameters. Like I think they're identifying a grading, and then they're like turning a wheel that has like some relevance to kind of like how the grading is presented. And that's your first order representation, which is just simple feedback from previous trials. So this is, again, the teacher-student model where you have some thing that's produced by the student. They give it to the teacher gives them feedback, and then they edit their paper or whatever, and then the teacher gives them more feedback and so forth. And so this is a simple feedback loop like this where you have a stimulus, a response, and then there's some maybe some effect on the stimulus, or it's some effect that cumulative presentations of the stimulus have on a response. And so this is a very simple sort of hypothesis for how the brain is dealing with this information. In a Bayesian model, you might have a prior distribution of stimuli, you would have an empirical observation, and then a posterior. In reinforcement learning, you might implement this with an actor-critic policy, which is a method that they use there. And I think we're just going to focus on the Bayesian model for this project, but reinforcement learning could be used as well. Finally, there's this higher order representation. So this is someone who's trying to walk down the street in this barrel, and they're trying to keep their, keep from falling out or whatever. So you have a lot of feedback that you need to get from the barrel, from the street, and all that to keep your balance in it. And so that's the idea behind this sort of behavioral tuning. So in this case, you have a stimulus and a response. There's interaction there, and there's feedback in the response. There are smaller feedbacks within this that keep it upright. And so in this data set, you have the mouse is like turning a wheel, and then they get a reward at the end. And there's, I don't know what the variable structure is that you might find useful for this representation, but what you would do is you would like look at there are a number of variables, you'd relate them to one another. You might run like a PCA to see what the components of these variables are, or just use a Bayesian model, plug it into a Bayesian model where you have a prior, an empirical observation, and then a posterior that feeds back to the prior in some way, where you would update the prior, and then that would be used as the new prior, something like that. Reinforcement learning, you might have like learning with some interference. I'm not up to date on the latest policies in reinforcement learning, but again, that's not something we need to worry about right now. And so this is the idea here, is that you have these three sort of models or hypotheses. You have the zero order model, which again is a sort of control condition or random condition, but it's something that doesn't imply any sort of feedback. You have a first order feedback where there's like obviously some history of the stimulus being taken into account. And then there's this higher order processing, which is where there are a number of feedback loops operating, but we don't really know the structure for sure. But that's our third hypothesis. And so this red circle represents a variable or group of variables that describes a hypothesized mechanism. So that's the data. And then this black square is a simulation that describes the mechanism. So what you're doing is you're comparing the model with the data. You have a data set. You can put together the data set any way you want. You can look at different relationships. And then you have a model of this, which is the Bayesian model, which is, if you just were to take the parameters of the data and build distributions of that, you would have something that was, you could compare with the model-free data. So the data is model-free. The data doesn't have any model associated with it. The data, though, you can take the descriptive parameters of the distributions that the data form and plug it into a model, and then that's the difference there. And so Jesse actually mentioned that what was kind of cool this week that he learned was something about Bayesian utilities. And so, you can use that in a number of ways as well. You can use utilities to bias learning to see if there's a preference in the learning process or what might control it. And you might also be able to explain biases in the experimental data. So any sort of skewness that you observe in the variables, is there like a utility that's shaping that the organism might be using? Like, if the organism is looking at a pattern on a screen and they're choosing that pattern or they're clicking on the button, are there utilities, are there maybe like decision making utilities or perceptual utilities that are involved in that and that's shaping their behavior? And so that's something that's also worth investigating. I don't know, again, that might be a little hard to implement, but those are all things to think about. And finally, your recurrent loops. When I say recurrent loops, I mean that you have these feedback loops that lead to measurement or measurement of prediction error. And so you have the data and you have a model. And the idea is that the model predict the data. Is there some measurement prediction error? There's some, is it something that's, is the model something that's good at predicting the data or not? And that's why, I'm having you do a number of different levels of complexity, because we don't know what's going on in the brain in terms of processing. It could be a very simple mechanism, or it could be something complex. But if you test a range of these models and you look at like how well they fit the data, then you can get closer to that answer. And it can, give you some insights into, maybe what's going on in the brain without having to look at the brain directly. And so that's all I have to say. Those are just some thoughts on the data.
Excuse me. I appreciate that. That definitely helps me understand more. After thinking about things, I think it. I have a better understanding this week, or at least as this week went along. I think the presentation helps clarify some stuff. So I'm sure. Like if anybody here is working on the project or will work on it with me, I'm sure we can talk about this more, or like even go over the slides again in the Slack or something. So, yeah. But I appreciate the presentation.
Welcome.
This gave me a really better understanding after I was trying to fight with myself and understand stuff. And yes, I would like to try to get more into it and work on. This is really interesting to me.
Yeah, thanks.
I think it's kind of interesting, like when we talk about what a representation is, and even if you've been looking at some of the stuff, I don't know if I did it. I missed some of this, like Wednesday and Tuesday. I didn't really get to see all those lectures yet. I'm going back towards that. But I don't know if they really talked quite a bit about if they talked about the what a representation is or isn't. Because it's sort of like when you hear, I feel like there's many different ways to refer to what a representation is, but in the case of this project, it's sort of the degrees of which feedback is incorporated into something. And if you looked at like the day 5 recurrent reinforcement learning, like they kind of spell out a bit more the concept of it, and they even go into what is a model. And you could say there's basically, having no feedback and no model of the world to these like more feedback, slightly more involved, first order, as it was as in the presentation, like just getting your foundation and then having a much more complicated loops, feedback loops, and more complicated model. It's kind of a general spectrum for it.
So yeah, just I wanted to be clear about representation too. We throw that word around a lot in this group. So representation is something that represents something else. So like when you interact with the world, and like I talked about the motor internal model for motor control. When you move your body, when you move your arms and legs or whatever, you have a model of that in your brain, and it isn't like an absolute predictive model, although there is a predictive element there. It's that you have a generalized model of the, that it draws from the sort of the body, the position of the limbs, the joints, and people argue about what's in the representation. Joint angles, the velocity of movement, and so forth. So those are all sort of in this model, and people don't really agree on what the representation is actually. They've written papers, people write papers on these kind of representations. I picked the internal model in the cerebellum because that's probably one of the most studied models of this type, where people will draw a model, and it's not really based on anatomy necessarily. It's just like, here's what's involved in this model, and they draw like all the components that you basically take something going on in the world and you abstract away all of its features that are salient, right? So like it could be joint angles on your arm, or it could be the velocity of your hand that sort of predict movement. And so then your brain uses these variables to sort of generalize to every other setting that you need, whether it's picking up a cup or like running a marathon, or should your arms be, or like playing the violin. There are all these different movements that we do, and there's motor prediction in that. And so that internal model has to be general enough to predict across all those contexts. And so that's at least the hypothesis behind it. The question is, what does it look like? And nobody knows. It's just how many variables are involved, what has to be measured by the brain. That's basically the idea behind that's what we mean by representation. And if you look at like the literature on in cognitive science, you'll see that they talk about like representations of higher level cognition, like language and art. Language is another good example where you have how do we represent language? Do we just use phonemes? Do we use whole words? Do we use sounds and string them together? And so, I don't know the state of the art there either, but there's debate on how that representation is constructed in the brain. And so,
I mean, there's a lot that I think this is probably sufficient for this discussion here. But if anybody looks at our past meetings or other things, like one of the things I've been interested in has been just there's a really broad spectrum of representation. Like at one end you have something called radical embodied cognition in terms of like human representation, or at least in a human context or in a physical context. Radical embodied cognition is basically zero representation, and
because you're using the environment. You're using the environment to represent things.
Yeah, and there's this there's at a human level there's a mesh, or at a biological interaction level there's a mesh point between the environment and the agent. And as you kind of go up the scale of representationalism, there's sort of an increased, I don't want to say difference, but like the furthest end of the spectrum from that is like the brain in a vat idea, where it's just you have this totally separate, removed brain that's very far removed from reality, and all the brain does is create these models very, very far away, and then crunches numbers, and then input number crunch output, and it's they're very far apart from each other. And I feel like that's kind of the spectrum, and a lot of things play out on that level. But at the same time, there's also smaller scale. Like, are you representing your heartbeat? Like, are you consciously representing that? No. But where does that regulation happen, and what kind of representation needs to be happening in the smaller components of different kinds of regulation? Like, you can look at it at different scales, and I think that can be a whole conversation for another time. But representation is a really interesting concept philosophically, and put into modeling. Like, we're talking about modeling here in Neuromatch Academy. It's a very specific tool. Like, if people did day 5 reinforcement learning, I would kind of point out, like, one of the last things on the day was updating. I forgot the specific technical term, but like updating how often the agent, the degree to which the agent is updating its world view. And like one of the last tutorials was, you start out with this box of, that the agent had to kind of move out of the box. Yeah. I'm sorry?
It was called the environment, the grade in which the agent was supposed to get to the optimal solution, and then it would also planning again, like it was getting one real data and then planning new strategies for it k times after getting real data.
Yeah, was it the same under the same umbrella of like the Q learning versus like the DynaQ learning? I think.
Yes.
So,
the planning thing is the DynaQ learning.
Yeah, and it was like these different amounts of. You could say that's part of representation, and how is the representation being updated. But that's a more specific. there are many examples we could draw from this week and talk about that, but that's the last thing.
Like if you talk about models alone, wouldn't it be like right to say that the zero order thing is mostly just a logistic regression? Like it's just taking in one stimulus and giving you yes or no depending on a threshold that it got from previous experiences or like whatever.
Yes.
So if you could just like for the rat thing, we have like different contrast images. The rat just has a threshold that if the image is better than this threshold, it will classify it as coming from left or right. So that's essentially zero order thing. And then if it receives the stimulus back upon its action, like the reward that it received for the last time, that could be first order. And if it is integrating multiple sensory signals, then it could be higher order. Like just to think of the model that we could make for judging that.
Yeah, that sounds good.
The first order can be like the hidden Markovians or the Kalman filtering thing that they taught in the middle of week 2.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to I think for this coming week, we kind of come up with a sort of a short-term plan for how, it might be addressed. Well, you can even mention that in the presentation that there are other methods that you could use for these different types of loops that, would be maybe more suited to figuring out how well they fit the data. Because, like I said, it's when you get up to these complex relationships, they're kind of hard to tease out. And so if we can use something that's a powerful method, and like I told my other groups, you have to be comfortable with the methods if you want to use them. Like you should, if you propose something that you want to kind of use, even if it's just to mention it, I would try to be at least somewhat comfortable with it. And just because you want to be able to describe it to people in detail and maybe implement it. Some of my other groups are implementing some, pretty high-end models, and I kept telling them, I've been telling them that, you must be familiar with this, and they seem to be, but it's always a caveat when you use models that you don't want to just dump that into it and then, get a result you can't interpret. That's always a bad thing, because you don't know if you got an answer, if it's right, you don't know why it's right, and so. And I think I know Sunidhi is on another project, but that's good advice, I think, for any project, is to make sure that you know why you're doing something or how it works. But I think that's a good idea, to have, there are other models you can use, I think.
Did you actually want to say anything about your project, Sunidhi, or you don't have to, since we talked about ours?
Yeah, so we actually okay. So we're working on the XCP dataset. It has time series data of fMRI images related to in resting state, and then the time series of subjects that were involved in some tasks and stuff. So we started out with a question of we'll try to address if there are subjects of varying ages. So we try to address the question of if there's a difference between the networks in the brain while doing a certain task in a younger brain as compared to an older brain. So we started out with this, but then we found out that XCP dataset is actually having info of only subjects of age 22 to 35, so that got dished. Then we kind of tried to do it with the gender part, like male and female, but then our mentor actually suggested that that might not be feasible in this 2-week period, so we might want to just switch to finding basic principles in the variability, functional connectivity among individuals, and then so inter-individuality functional connectivity patterns versus intra patterns. So we have multiple scans for each patient. So it's broadly basically getting an idea if the inter-individual scans are maybe different from intra-individual scans. So it's just like getting an idea of how to like get your hands dirty with the data, how to understand that there's a particular pattern and if they're similar or different. It's like addressing a very basic question now. So, yeah, so right now we've just gone ahead and done some like Pearson correlation, some PCA, and then like, we do have a meeting tomorrow, so let's see how things go ahead. But yeah. So the main constraint basically came was you can't achieve enough in 2 weeks because like the two other members of my group are also not technically very familiar with Python and stuff. So we can settle down to a very basic project. Yeah.
Well, that was pretty much in line with what you had suggested, what you were interested in before Neuromatch.
Yeah, that's why I kind of pushed to get that younger and older thing into it, but like I don't agree, and then so maybe like I can pursue it later with some other data set or like, yeah, but right now there's just this.
I think that I'm kind of straddling between like I'm still in my actual pod and then doing a group project that shifted away into this one, but that was completely the same experience that would happen in my pod about, and I feel like that's actually important. Like, I don't think people are going to be like making this a big part of their presentations about, oh, here's what we tried and didn't work, because it's not really a lot of fun. But it's something that's really important to go through, like, even just getting used to the data and like, oh, this won't really work, and like, that's an important part of things for sure. And yeah, I think, oh yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the sort of hidden benefits of all the Neuromatch stuff is that I know there was sort of talk about, there's something on the website about going to a public, like getting things to a certain publication if you do your group project, and I don't really know what that is or the status is because I haven't heard a lot about that, but I think definitely there will be a lot of opportunities for people to follow up on their own stuff afterwards, because I think it's sort of hard to see, but a lot of seeds are being planted for things to kind of continue on after these 3 weeks, and that's important.
Yeah.
Also, I was going to ask you, calling you, Anson.
Yeah, my group said a similar thing. We originally we were looking into hidden Markov law for assignments data, and we had pretty lofty goals involving evaluating connectivity. But now we're scaling it back to LDA and a smaller section of the data, much more specific questions, because we don't have time. We're all burnt out from how intensive Neuromatch is.
Yeah.
We were actually talking about like continuing working on the data after Neuromatch though, because we were interested and we enjoyed working together.
Yeah, I think that's good. So yeah, and again, if you want to work on this project after Neuromatch, I mean, we're just trying to get it to where you can like say, this is the project, and maybe like get some preliminary results, which is, I mean, I don't know what their requirements are for submission at the end. I think they just want you to like worked in the, gotten your feet wet in the data and everything, but definitely if there's something we want to follow up on, we can do that after the end of Neuromatch. But I think it's important for everyone just to kind of get it, some experience in looking at these models and trying to implement them and thinking about them anyways. Like I said, you do have to understand the models to really kind of implement them. But that being said, I think it's also important to like kind of explore a little bit or to think about them. Prakash, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to tell about my experience. I think Neuromatch is kind of like a crash course on the approach to modeling, and I mean they're trying to tell stuff which maybe they have learned the hard way over the years, but I mean over 3 weeks they
want to tell people about like how to approach modeling, and I mean, it's not very important to get stuck on the specific stuff on the various days. I mean, that's not the gist of it. The gist of it is like doing like a crash course over 3 weeks, like just learning the approach. And like since the content will be available for a long time, maybe like you can delve into the specific parts of it afterwards, and just make a basic project, so like the trial and error part of it is important. Thinking and seeing if the model works or not, and then, redesigning it.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Even like for myself, I haven't. My undergraduate experience was I did some stuff in a neuroscience lab, but I wasn't doing PCA. I was only working with the data. I was more of a technical person. So like I've never really been in a place where I've been exposed to hardcore computational focus on any kind of a biological or cognitive data set. So getting that experience for me has been huge. And I know for some people it's their bread and butter to have that experience, but like the exposure for me has been great. And I think I really agree with what was just said, and especially in that context. So yeah.
I think something I really got out of Neuromatch is understanding probability is really, really important if you want to learn things quickly and rigorously. Like, I think I might like crack open like a mid-level stats book and just work through like conditional distributions, conditional independence, because like I feel like most of the days I kept up the linear algebra pretty okay, but when there was too much stats, I got confused. So I think that's definitely, like, for me, it highlighted, like, okay, so what do I need to learn in order to learn this stuff efficiently? Because it wasn't like, I feel like if I could keep up with some math, I generally could have kept up with most of the material. So I think it was good in terms of like, okay, so what do I need to work on or to access this better? So it was, even though it was definitely above a lot of it was definitely above my current background, I still think it was important just for like sampling what's out there and the general concepts and what I need to learn.
Yeah, I had a late night discussion or rant or monologue, whatever you want to say, with Anson and another friend about, man, like this. I have this quest, like I want to get all like the sort of the baseline stuff prerequisite for doing the cool, like to do really cool research. Like you kind of have to have a background in math, statistics, applied math, probability, and the code to do it. And then once you have that, you can look at really interesting questions in the way that a lot of the organizers and the senior people are doing. And it's like, yeah, so Neuromatch is kind of giving me a really good lens to say, all right, here's what you need to do some of that stuff. And now it's just, okay, building that up while getting to work on and towards those questions. So,
yeah, it's good. So, yeah, that was a good conversation. I can encourage people to go on into Slack and NMA feedback and really go through those channels, because that's the NMA feedback, especially for the project. We've done some conversation there, and kind of gets like long with people putting in like entries, but if you go back, you can see like kind of what's going on. It just kind of, you get lost in it. But so we're at the top of the hour, and I want to do a talk on information theory. But I mean, if you have to go,
yeah.
What was that?
So I was actually waiting, like, when you start on that.
Oh, yeah.
You didn't mention.
Yeah, I'm going to do that now. And if you have to leave, it's fine. You can leave. I'm going to have this recorded. But I'm going to do this. Yeah. It's so you don't get exposure to this, as far as I know, in Neuromatch.
Yeah, I've seen like some allusions to information theory, like in the opening slides, and some talk about it, but not like, hey, here's an information theory, like a basic. It's directly. I don't know. Did anybody else see that? But
yeah. Let me do this. So I'm going to go through it quickly. I'll put the other slides on in the Slack channel, and I'll put these up on Slack as well. So this is
all these videos are going to be on YouTube for anybody who has to go or whatever.
Yeah. So and hopefully this will be a good introduction. It's pretty broad ranging, but I think you'll get an appreciation for how information theory is sort of applied to different areas of science and what it's all about. So this is an overview for simulators and broad thinkers. I just wanted to, you'll find a lot of information theory stuff online, but it's very abstruse, and it has like a, they have the equations and everything, but it's not really very accessible, I would say. I really don't, especially for an introductory approach. They're like textbooks, like the Cover textbook, but again, that's going to be like a lot of math, and so I'm trying to minimize the math here, whatever loads, and I'm trying to give you a good idea of like how it applies to different domains. There we go. So yeah, this is wow, it's taking a long time. This is a pretty broad overview. There we go. All right. So those images may or may not have anything to do with information theory. I just picked them.
I was going to make a joke that maybe you need to go back and hit run on the prerequisite cells in the Colab notebook, but that's a Neuromatch joke, and I'm kind of just, as I'm saying it and talking out loud, it's like, wow, I'm really making a Neuromatch collab.
Yeah.
So I've gone. That's how far it's gone.
These are just, I mean, these are nice pictures, and they may have something to do with information theory, but we're not going to talk about that.
They may or may not.
Yeah, pretty much.
Is it still loading? Or?
No, it's.
I see your cursor on the screen, so that's good.
Do you see the main slide here?
I do not. I see a loading indication.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, you do? There should be slides here.
Still the loading indication.
Oh.
Yeah. I don't know if you could re-share the screen, maybe?
Yeah, let me try that. Because it's, it took a long time to load, so it might be...
Maybe you unshare the screen, then present, and then share it. Maybe it's not like...
Alright.
Yeah.
Let me reshare. Okay. How about now?
I see
nothing yet.
Totally blank.
Huh.
Just the gray background.
Gray background? What don't I not? Oh, I have to stop this. Stop the sharing. And then I'll go back and do this sharing. Okay. How about now? Can you see it now?
I don't. I see a space where something's supposed to be, but I don't see it.
I don't know why it's not sharing.
How about if we do this in Meet or something, Google Meet or something?
If you're just he's running, the mic might be still in there, but I don't hear Bradley right now.
You don't? I'm here. I don't know.
That could be me too.
Yeah.
It seems to totally be me because now my audio got rerouted. Sorry, hold on.
Uh-oh. How about now?
I'm recovered and I'm good.
Okay, good.
Although I don't know where Anson is.
Yeah, well, he'll probably be here in a minute. don't know if I want to start before he shows up, but well, why don't I start and then I'll let him in. So let me share my screen and we can do this. All right. Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Good. So this is the may or may not have anything to do with information theory image selection here. And so why don't we start? Okay. So this is Claude Shannon. He was I think I talked about him before. He was the sort of the originator of modern information theory, what we think of as information theory. He worked at Bell Labs, and he had a lot of different things that he did. He was a juggler, and he built these little mouse robots and put them in mazes. And that was there he is. So one of the things, though, he's best known for was information theory. And information theory, quantitative information theory, I should say. And so this is the Shannon-Weaver model of communication. And so you can see that it talks about communication in terms of a channel. And so he was interested in sending messages over telegraph cables and trying to figure out how to encode those messages and clean them up so that you didn't get a lot of noise. And so this is efficient transmission of a signal over a noisy channel. And so the idea was that you could use mathematics to take binary values of a string and figure out how much information was in it. And basically you would have expected versus unexpected configurations of messages. So if a message had a certain structure of zeros and ones, you could identify it as some, describing something, even if it was corrupted or if it had noise in it. And so that was the idea. And so the equation is actually fairly simple. There are no integrals in this version, but this is a summation sign here. This is information entropy. So people will talk about information. They'll talk about information entropy. Entropy being a lot of variation versus a lot of homogeneity. So if it's all zeros, there's no entropy. If there's 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, that's a lot of entropy, or maximum entropy, some people might call it. But you basically take something here and you take the log of it and you sum over all of those instances and you get this information entropy. So this thing that you're logging are the probability of events or states of a single instance. So you have this instance of something, you look at the probability of it, like in that string I told you about with zeros and ones, you might have a probability of ones, and then that probability is logged, and it's logged at the base of n, which if you're dealing with binary strings, you can use log n, n equals 2. But if you're looking at continuous values, and some applications do that, you can use log 10. Some people use log e, which is the natural log that has its own applications. And then the second part of the equation are the sum of all probabilities for an entire ensemble. So an ensemble is just a collection of variables that you want to measure its information in. And then you have this hx, which is the actual information over this ensemble. So this symbol here is just the sum sign from I to n being not log n, but whatever your number in your ensemble is. And so that's pretty simple. But to apply it to something practical, we need to look to other we don't need to worry about the equation so much. One of those things is a weather forecast. So this is a nice little comic. It's a joke. It's supposed to be if you look at the 5-day weather forecast versus the 5 trillion year weather forecast, which is if the planet is destroyed in 5 trillion years and we're in space. So there's no real information in this. The idea behind this is that weather forecasts often contain varying degrees of information. And if you're in a case like this where it's basically the same conditions for most of the forecast, there's really no information in that forecast. But if you have a forecast where, like this, where you have, the temperature goes up and then it goes down like this, so you have a large range in temperatures, there's a lot of information in this forecast. Okay, so that's the idea, that if things go as expected, there's already no information for me to worry about. If there are things that happen that are like variable, then maybe it's raining and sunny on alternate days during the week. That's something that I need to know. That's information I need to know. And so there's information in that forecast. And so the most variation denotes the most information. But the sampling interval is also important. So in this case of the 5 trillion year weather forecast, you're sampling at a scale where, the phenomenon is the planet's been destroyed, now you're in space for the rest of the time. Whereas in this case, at a 5-day forecast, you're in the middle of winter, it's just the same weather. It's just like a typical, northeastern North American winter where the temperature is always like this. And sometimes you get cold snaps, but this is where you have the, there's very little information in this other than the rain showers. But, so if there's uniformity, it's not informative. But to capture the true and meaningful state for each element in the ensemble, you want something at the appropriate time scale or spatial scale. And so this is something called Polya's urn. And this tells you something about how you sample from a distribution to get information or to evaluate information. And so I don't know if they covered this little thought experiment in Neuromatch, but this is something that's often used in probability, especially when you're talking about sampling with replacement or without replacement. So this is an urn, and this has a bunch of colored balls in it. And say that I can't see inside the urn. They show the balls for convenience sake, but say I don't see anything, and I can't see through the urn, and I want to pick balls out of it, and I want to predict what color balls are in, what the distribution of the colors are in this urn, just by sampling it one at a time. And so I pick balls out, and I can either just take them out one at a time without replacing them, or I can sample with replacement. And so if I sample with replacement, it changes the distribution of what's in the urn. But if I sample without replacement, I can eventually get all of the states and their distributions out on the table. And so this is a tool people use to talk about distributions, but it's also good for information because we understand that the red balls are one state and the green balls are another state. And now you can think of that as like 0 and 1 in the binary case. And what we want to do is assess the amount of information in this urn, given the color and distribution of the color of these balls. If we have a lot of red balls, there's very little information in that urn. Every time we pick something out, it's going to be red. If it's a mix of red and green, then we have no idea what we're going to get when we pick out of the urn. And so that's the idea of information. Are you going to be surprised when you pick out of that urn and find something? Or is that something that you can expect there always to be a red or always to be a green ball coming out of it? I'm going to talk about surprise in a couple slides. I didn't put that in before mutual information, but so mutual information then is the combination of information from two categories. So sometimes we're interested in taking those two categories and finding what information they have in common. So say you have two variables that are independent, x and y, and the hx and hy are the information in each of those variables. So your variables are, they have a noise component and a information component. And so your x and y are going to both have information, and if you compare them, there's some overlap in the information part, and that's your hxy. So, if you compare the two variables, there's a mutual dependence of those two variables, and that's your information. And that's the idea behind mutual information. People will use this for, looking at different categories of like gene expression or different categories of like perception. If you have two categories and you want to know if there's like an interaction between them or some dependence between them, we've talked about causality in Neuromatch. This might be a tool for looking at that. It's a good way to do it, and it's a kind of a hard measure to get your head around, but it's something worth looking into if you're interested. semantic information is then, you might ask, well, if we have these binary strings, that's just the structure of the data. It's not really describing the meaning of the data. But people have thought about this, and so semantic information, people have been working on this in different computer science labs. This is a measure of semantic ambiguity and uninformativeness. So it operates like standard information theory, where you have a bunch of things distributed over a string or a set of data, and you want to find out the relative frequency of different states. And so in this case, each word in a sentence can be mapped to the next word. So if I take this sentence, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, I can take the word brown, given the word quick, and I can calculate the probability of those two things being linked together. If I do that, then it tells me that these words co-occur, but I still need to calculate the frequency in my corpus, such as the body of text, of this co-occurrence. And so I can do this for every word and get a bunch of different conditional probabilities and then look at their frequency. And so what you find, of course, is if two words are linked, there might be a semantic connection between them. So like brown fox is a semantic connection because brown describes the color of a fox. And so people use this to tell, if there's semantic content in a bunch of words. People also use techniques like bag of words and n-grams to characterize sentences, but this is different. I wanted to make that clear. This is different from those kind of methods because they use conditional probabilities, and then ultimately they'll use the information theory measure to look at the content. And then there's Fischer information, which is where you measure information of random variable x that's contained in parameter theta. And so what this is Fischer information is a good way to look at like a model-free data set and compare it to sort of a model of the data or of the variable. So parameter theta is a description of this, say, distribution of data. It's a theoretical distribution. And random variable x is something you're observing in the environment. And you want to know how much information from the environment is contained in that theoretical distribution. So parameter theta is the mean and standard deviation of the distribution that models x. But you want to know about the actual measure of x, which might vary quite a bit from the theoretical model of the distribution. And so you can use Fischer information to quantify that relationship. And they actually use this in Bayesian likelihood estimation, which is why I brought it up. This is where you estimate a prior from an observation of data. So if you see Fischer information, you kind of know what it is now. There's also the Callback Liebler divergence, which is measuring the similarity, calculating the log odds ratio between two distributions. So you have these two distributions that you want to find the amount of information that's shared between them. It's kind of like the mutual information. One variable is going to predict something about another variable, but we don't know how much of that. And so this is the equation here. It's similar to information theory, except it's a ratio here instead of just a simple probability. We had a question in the comments here. A couple questions. Prakash, if I recall correctly, there was a study on selection of particular words in a conversation between healthy subjects and how it can predict who will become schizophrenic over a period of time. That's good. Sounds really cool. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, there are a lot of applications to these methods. So if you have one that you think is great, put it in the chat. So a lot of what I'm talking about is pretty theoretical stuff, but you're going to find that it's going to apply to a lot of different things, potentially. So now this is something that Jesse and Anson might find interesting. This is Gibsonian information. And so this isn't like a formal set of equations, but this is how J.J. Gibson here thought about information. And it's very different from like Shannon information in that motion, visual motion in particular, provides information. So if we look at Gibson here, he's static. But if we look at him now over on the right, I have this thing that's simulating his motion through space. And so you can see that this is like a representation of the motion, but it has information in the motion. If he's moving versus static, there's information that I'm getting from that image. And so there are a lot of things in J.J. Gibson wrote a book on ecological psychology, and in that book he talks a lot about optical flow and structure from motion, where if something is something is camouflaged in the woods in the background, you don't notice it, but when it starts moving against that background, you start to notice that thing. And so that's motion providing information. And as far as I've known, no one's given that a mathematical treatment, but this is just like, it's just something to be aware of. We can maybe talk about this after Neuromatch. But here's surprise. Now we finally get to surprise. So back in the Polya's urn slide, I talked about being surprised by your selection of a ball from the urn. And so, but this is also a perceptual thing. This is a perceptual thing that they measure in like, I think they're using it in some of the brain theories of Friston and so forth.
Oh, you don't have to look at that right now.
Okay.
Just later. But
Yeah,
I was saying, it'd be cool to compare those things.
It would be, yeah. So this is sometimes people call Bayesian surprise, but the basic idea of surprise is that if I observe something like flipping a coin, which you see up at the upper right, and I want to observe this occurrence of events, what can I gain out of that? What's surprising to me about coin flips? We assume coin flips are like a 50-50 proposition. You flip a coin, it's heads or tails. But if you actually flip a coin for like a sequence of maybe 50 or 100 flips, you notice that they're actually drift from that expectation. But what about this coin flipping is surprising to you? I mean, is there something that's is there a result that's surprising? And how much information does that have? So we can use this formulation of information, or this sort of the last half of the information equation, 1 over px, which is kind of a normalization technique. And then you have this coin flipping experiment for 10 trials. So the expectation is 5 heads and 5 tails. And that's 1 bit of information. And that's sort of the maximal, variation. But there's something else. You don't want to necessarily measure the maximum amount of variation here. You want to measure how often or infrequently does the thing I'm interested in occur. And so in that case, we have 2 examples. So in the first, we have where you end up flipping the coin and you get 9 heads and 1 tail with a probability. We're looking for the probability of tails, and we find that it's very rare. So it's surprising to find a tail. So it's a probability of 0.1, and that gives you 3.32 bits as it works out with this equation. There's a lot of information in that because you don't see it that often. So if you don't see it, then you can't say that tails ever occurs. But if you observe it once, it's surprising, and there's a lot of information in that observation. Then to take the reverse case, you see 9 heads and 1 tail. But now we're looking at the probability of heads. And so the probability of heads isn't surprising at all. If you get a head, of course you're going to get a head. It almost always happens. So you get a probability of 0.9, and that's a very low information content of 0.15 bits. And so you can see like the perspective matters as well in information theory. You have to define a lot of things within that simple equation. What's your perspective? What counts as information? There's a nominal definition, but we have to think about these things. So information theory has also been used in psychophysics a lot. And so back in the 50s, information theory was kind of like the deep learning of its day. Everyone seemed to think they could apply it to human cognition. And so there are a couple people who you might look into. Atneve, he looked at the problem in this way. The perceptual machinery strips away redundancy in a stimulus. So when you look at something, it strips away that redundancy that you have in the environment. So you're just getting like the basic information of what's in the environment and not like maybe the background or anything. This encodes information more economically, and information reduces uncertainty. So they're looking at it in terms of sort of an economy of processing and then ultimately decision making. Quastler did a study called the Studies of Human Channel Capacity. So he's looking at human cognition as information processing. And of course, this predates cognitive science, but cognitive science and the cognitive revolution in psychology kind of comes out of this line of thought. And then finally, you have people like Fitz, who developed Fitz's law, and also the idea of the magical number 7 in working memory. And so, do you know the laws? And so these are the psychological laws, psychophysical laws you might be familiar with: Hicks' law, Fitz's law, Miller's law. And so Hicks' law is, of course, based on information theory. You see a similar formulation of what you saw in the first slides. This is looking at reaction time given a number of options. So this is where you have a number of things to choose from, and you have a reaction time to pick one of those things. And so if you measure the reaction time for that, as it turns out, as you increase the number of options, your reaction time goes up, but it doesn't go up linearly. It goes up in this sort of curvilinear fashion, this logarithmic fashion, where the more options you have, eventually you start to treat like, you see 3 options, you choose between the 3 options. If you see an array of 16 options, you might be able to pick it out in terms of like its relative position in that array. And so it saves you some time in picking out or figuring out where it is. You don't have to observe every single position. You kind of know where it is. And so psychophysical laws were built around this measurement of information. Hicks' law, of course, we've talked about. And it's important to note that, and this is important for the next slide as well, that your criterion for what is information or what is a bit is going to change with your context. And so in Hicks' law, we kind of see that. But in Miller's law, we really see that. And so Miller's law is this idea of working memory allowing you to hold 7 plus or minus 2 items at any one time. And so people have done experiments where they've had people recite numbers or letters or words, and they can hold roughly 7 objects at one time. All right, so this is the basis for a lot of the research on multitasking. What is it that you can hold in working memory, and what distracts you, what makes you forget things in short-term memory? And so you can see this graph down here. There's channel capacity, and you have different things that you can remember in terms of their element size. And so, so this limit of working memory is called capacity. So this is similar to Shannon's channel capacity. The problem, though, is that how do you define an item? So an item could be a single letter, or as it turns out, you can actually chunk these letters into words and chunk the words into sentences. And so it makes it pretty flexible, right? You talk about information having a capacity. Well, if you take single letters, there's a capacity for that. But if you take whole sentences, there's a capacity for that. But that's a very different amount of information if you think about it in terms of, go back to thinking about it in terms of the letters. So there's that slipperiness of the definition. And maybe it turns out that, you can make things more efficient by using one element in that sentence. There are different coding strategies, but it's important to recognize that, I think, when evaluating this kind of work. But nevertheless, we can think about it in terms of capacity. But there's also integrated information, which is a more recent idea. And this is not thinking about information in terms of capacity at all. This is thinking about information in terms of sort of the information that we're getting out of the environment and how we operate on it. And so this is I don't know if you've heard about integrated information. They talk about it a lot in consciousness research. This is the citation down at the bottom of the slide. This is a Nature Review Neuroscience article on integrated information. And it basically reduces a lot of the higher level representation that we do down to a single measure of integrated information. And so, you experience the world, you build a conceptual structure. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in the brain, and then we can measure that in terms of integrated information. And it's supposed to allow us to understand consciousness a little bit better, because it's dealing with this experiential aspect of learning. And so this is far different from the capacity model, but it still uses the same basic idea of information. And then I just kind of added in positional information, so we can even go beyond perception and think about things like biological development. And so there people applied the idea of information theory to positional information in embryos. And so in embryos, the cells divide and they have this, there's a hypothesis that they understand their position in the embryo and that their position is important for this defining their identity. So cells differentiate and they form structures, and then their position in that structure, their position in the embryo, determines where they end up going, their fate in embryogenesis and that sort of thing. So there's a paper, Positional Information in Bits, where they talk about finding the information content of an embryo. So they argue that every nucleus can be labeled with a unique identity, and that an embryo has log 2 n bits of information, which means that whatever this unique identity is, that's the information content of an embryo. And so I give that example because people have tried to measure the information content of the genome, and it's been pretty sloppy because they've talked about, like, well, what do you use as a level of analysis? Do you use like the base pairs? Do you use like what the genes produce? Do you use like, what's the unit of measurement? And so in this case, they're using cells. They're actually using a nucleus label. But that's not really a good measure of information in an embryo because the cells express a lot of different genes. They change their identity throughout development. And so there are good things about this that allows you to model this sort of positional information, but it also doesn't allow you to understand like information variability in a single sort of unit in the ensemble. So finally, I give this slide again for Anson and Jesse, and this is linking information to the Evergood regulator theorem. And so there's this idea of we talk about W.R. Ashby's Evergood regulator theorem in this group a lot, and he has this requisite variety condition, and states that variety is the total number of possible states in a system. Variety can destroy variety, but what happens is you have the environment and you have this internal model. And this is just in the brain, but Ashby talks about models, but we'll talk about this in terms of the brain and internal model. These models, the environment and the internal model, both have to have the same amount of information, all right? And so variety can destroy variety by compressing, filtering, or some other mechanism to make sure that these representations have roughly the same amount of information. And so, again, like when I talked about perception, that's an interesting point because what your perceptual system might be doing is taking information out of the environment, destroying maybe redundancy, and compressing that down into what it thinks is the amount of information that matches the environment. But when you apply Newton's third law, you find that there has to be this sort of balance of information between the internal model and the environment. So one of the things that happens is offloading from like the internal model into the environment. So when the environment contains too much information, something called cognitive offloading occurs, where you take things from the brain and you put them in the environment. It could be like in a desktop, like where you leave things on your desktop to remind you. It could be like sticky notes, or it could be like signposts out in the environment. And those are things that when the environment is too complex, you compensate by building this model of offloading. But it also suggests that you can take the internal model and the offloaded information and use it to interpret the environment. So this is something that I just kind of threw in here to get people thinking about that if you're interested. And I thought that was an interesting relationship there. I ran across some stuff on the good regulator theorem while I was researching this, so I thought I'd bring it up. I don't really have any more insights into it. But anyways, that's the end of the talk. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. I know it was a little rough getting here, but thank you for paying attention.
No, I enjoyed it.
Okay. So if you have any questions,
there's like a whole bunch of stuff I could say about the Evergood theorem and everything else, but I don't. I'll probably say that afterwards because I don't want to bore everybody with that.
if day one we were kind of introduced to this with the why thing, like how can you process this with the least amount of information possible?
Yeah.
We were introduced to the Shannon entropy thing.
Yeah. And I think let me try to find one of the slides about something. Yeah, there's so many things in Neuromatch that are like really it's like really right on the cusp of what we're learning directly. Yeah, even like positional information and a lot of the way I'm trying to find another slide, but yeah, suffice to say, it's very much a lot, especially I think in like I realize that like Bayes, like the guy Bayes is actually a few centuries in development. Like he's originally from like the 1700s or the 1800s, I forget. But just like the underpinning of a lot of these things is really interesting. But yeah.
Yes. Any other questions? I'll put the slides up on in Slack for people to look at. And if you have any questions, you can contact me in Slack or talk about it. I just wanted to kind of go through this because I know you didn't really get exposure to it, but I thought it might be useful.
Is there a specific Slack channel that would be good? Because I was looking to have post some stuff over the slides here. Is there a specific Slack channel that you think would go best for these, or should I make something about information or something like that? I don't know.
We could do that. Yeah, we could have an information channel.
There's a bunch of them, but I don't know how to really.
Well, yeah. Let me look over the channels. I don't have a working memory of all the channels because we can only put 7 things in there. So, I'll look it over. I think we might make a channel for it, but we might also, because there are too many channels, it's hard to monitor all of them.
Yeah, and I mean, you can even put it in the meta-brain ones, but I know Anson and I we've mentioned integrated information theory and a lot of this stuff here, so I mean, I think there'll be something to follow up on, but as for today, I mean, it was great, and I think is there anything else we wanted to talk about today, or everybody's kind of gotta go, or we're done at this point?
Okay, well, if there's nothing else, if there are other questions, we can put them in Slack if there are any other questions. If you have questions about the project, please raise them in Slack as well. I think that's a good tool to use for, especially this weekend when you're kind of going through and trying to get into doing everything. And then by Wednesday, we should have a short presentation, and we can talk about that in Slack. And if people want to meet about that early next week, we can have like a short meeting, and so it should be fine. And I can give feedback on Slack as well. So, all right. Well, thanks for meeting. Good luck with week 3 of Neuromatch.
Week 3.
Yeah. And talk to everyone later.
Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Take care.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.